All right, we're talking about capturing the digital image, and if you're at that point in the trimester where you've just given up altogether reading this textbook, that's okay. I'm going to be completely frank with you. That's okay. I'm going to cover this with quite a bit of depth in this lecture, and the PowerPoints will be what I'll be testing you off of, right? Because I think the textbook did an excellent job of getting us to this place. But now we can start to rely on some real essential knowledge and some key application points. Because in my experience as a technologist, as a therapist, this knowledge has been very, very helpful for me in terms of navigating systems and making sure that patient pictures look good, making sure that I understand what's happening when the service guys come in and things like that. So there's a lot of application here. And that's going to be my focus. Here's the objectives. We're going to finally define the term digital imaging. We're going to give it a nice, neat definition. We'll talk about what I call latent image formation for conventional radiography. We'll cover that very quickly, right? Because it does kind of form the philosophy or the background for why they ask certain questions, and it still is there as we're applying this stuff. Then we're going to talk about computed radiography, which has a lot of relationships with conventional. And then we'll talk about indirect capture and direct capture for what we call digital radiography. Finally, we'll briefly talk about PACS and then communication in medicine, right? What we'll talk more about in terms of PACS and things like that is how we can gauge whether we've got a good picture or a bad picture on any one of these systems. So I want to show you on this single slide, there's some really important stuff in the terms I'm going to use. I'm going to try to be as specific as possible in these terms. First off is digital imaging, right? Digital imaging. That is different from conventional radiography. That is different from computed radiography. And that is different from digital radiography. That's a little confusing if you ask me, but I'm making a distinction between digital imaging. I'm saying it's the umbrella term, and underneath this big umbrella term of digital imaging, there hangs the two other kind of smaller terms, which are computed radiography and digital radiography, right? And then beneath digital radiography, we have direct capture and indirect capture. If you understand that kind of big picture, you're well on your way towards kind of getting the big takeaway for today. Here's some key terms that I've identified that'll be helpful to us, and it looks like it's not showing up completely here on the slide. But analog to digital, these are the good flashcard type terms, right? Analog to digital conversion, we should be pretty familiar with that. Computed radiography, and underneath that I've identified barium fluorohalide. That is one of the primary crystals that we'll use for computed radiography. We also, in computed radiography, scan the barium fluorohalide with a laser. So we'll define what that laser is about. We use and another term for that barium fluorohalide is that is a photostimulable phosphor. So that's just another term used to discuss what barium fluorohalide is. And the way that phosphor works, the way that barium fluorohalide works, is it has a phosphor center, phosphor layers, and then we use a photomultiplier to capture its photostimulable luminescence. When you scan it with a laser, it gives off light, in other words. On the opposite corner, I've got the stuff more related to digital radiography. So thin film transistors, sometimes that's abbreviated TFT, thin film transistors. Then there's direct capture, sometimes abbreviated DR, and it uses amorphous selenium. And then there's indirect capture, which the most commonly used thing is either cesium iodide or gadolinium oxysulfide. These are scintillating crystals. They make light, so when X-rays hit them, they make light. And then that's passed through amorphous silicon. So I wanted to put that both on the same slide because each one of these terms are super loaded terms. These are kind of the high dollar terms. Go ahead and recognize that if we're talking about direct capture, we're talking about amorphous selenium. If we're talking about indirect capture, we're talking about amorphous silicon. And I'll try to give us some mnemonics and things to remember that. And we'll also talk about charge couple devices, complementary metal oxide silicon, and detective quantum efficiency. So when it comes down to our discussion about packs, we're going to focus mostly on detective quantum efficiency and then how we translate that stuff to a digital image which can be stored in packs, right? So I'm not going to be defining packs or anything like that today. Let me skip on past that. I think there's two. Okay. Ignore the first objectives. I apologize. These objectives are going to be guiding us better. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
The ones you just went over,
Yeah, the ones I just went over. I thought I deleted that slide. I kind of beefed them up, and I've got.
There's another set of key terms too.
Is there? Okay, I'll have to look at that in a sec. I apologize. Oh, Lord. It's already happening. I was telling Nicole, ever since I became a dad, I couldn't even get gas in my car the other day. So bear with me. There is rhyme and reason to this. I apologize for the second set of. These are the objectives I want. So define digital imaging. It's the same thing. I've just re-expressed it better. Define digital imaging to include CR and DR, right? Just better worded. Discuss computer radiography, that should be CR, right? Oh, Lord. CR to include basic construction of the computer radiography cassette and an imaging plate, the process of photostimulation from the imaging plate, laser beam formation, and how the image is erased, right? So I've just kind of expanded that out from the previous objectives. Discuss digital radiography, DR, to include both direct and indirect systems, differentiating between those, knowing whether it's direct or indirect, and that's kind of what I was talking about the amorphous selenium versus the amorphous silicon. We're going to dig into that. Then we'll talk about the steps for X-ray to digital conversion. We'll talk about charge couple devices, detective quantum efficiency, and then spatial resolution. And of the two key terms, I'm going to go with the first key terms. I don't like these key terms, right? Just for added confusion, X out these key terms, not the previous ones. Okay. So let's define digital imaging. This is any image acquisition process that produces an electronic image that can be viewed and manipulated on a computer. Now notice I did not say any X-ray image. I said any image. So the pictures that you take with your camera, those are digital images, right? And in fact, it uses a thin film transistor and amorphous selenium to produce it. So whether or not you knew that or cared while you're taking pictures of your friends for Instagram, you are using a digital imaging system, and it's a form of direct capture, right? So we'll be talking about your cell phone camera today. In terms of medical imaging, digital imaging largely is taken to mean either computed radiography, which is abbreviated CR, or digital radiography, which is abbreviated DR. And this term was first coined in the 1970s with the advent of CT. So here I have one of the first CT head scanners that was produced by EMI. So CT has a close relationship to the advent of digital imaging in radiography because there was no other way to have a CT image except as a digital image. And this was before it was even useful to view it on a monitor. You would make this digital image, and since the monitors were still crap in the 1970s, you would then print that digital image back to film. And it was read on a film, the first CT scans. So I just want to be careful in those definitions that what we're talking about is the advent of digital imaging in radiology. And just so you know, it's only recently that we've even come to understand these terms, which is kind of funny. But when I was in school, we did not even have these basic definitions like what is CR, what is DR. We had a bunch of other crazy acronyms for stuff. So we finally have made some sense of it. And the big umbrella term is digital imaging. Underneath that, we have CR for computed radiography and DR for digital radiography, right? So let's talk about this versus that, CR versus DR. Why am I making such a big deal about these two different systems? Well, they definitely distinguish between us in our therapeutic roles as we're doing portal imaging versus us in the X-ray world. In the X-ray world, we kind of really need to know the difference between the two, and it's kind of what we eat, sleep, and breathe. It's the water that we swim in. So you have learned how to work in departments that have primarily CR systems, and then they might have like a DR Wi-Fi cassette that they use for their portal imager, right? So you might be having to do CR for most of your departmental work, and then when you roll out with the portable, you're able to do a DR picture. So you are becoming very accustomed to these two different worlds, the way that they affect workflow, et cetera, et cetera. But anytime we're talking about CR or computed radiography, we're talking about something that has a storage phosphor plate inside of a special cassette. You put that cassette inside of a reader here. This is a Fuji reader, I think. It pops up on an image viewing station, and it's able to use existing radiographic equipment. Like we have a Fuji, it's back there, yeah, a little hook. It's able to use the existing X-ray systems. Thank you. So like in our lab here in the school, I think y'all have all had a chance to take an X-ray at this point. We used a CR system to take that X-ray. It didn't require any fancy new equipment. In fact, the one room that we use, the smaller X-ray room, still has a 3-phase 6-pulse X-ray generator. It's old school, but can it take a CR image? Yeah, it can. So it's readily adaptable to old school conventional radiography, right? So let's define conventional radiography real quickly, just as a subset. We're talking about film. Anytime I talk about conventional radiography, I remember the days when we had a film screen combination. You would stick the film in a dark room. You would stick the film inside of a cassette that had 2 intensifying screens inside the cassette. You would put that cassette inside of the Bucky tray or whatever you're trying to take a picture of. If you're in a radiation therapy suite, you essentially would insert the cassette into a holder there in the therapy suite, and you would take your picture. You would have to then take the cassette into the dark room, open the cassette only in the dark room, right? Watch out that there's no static electricity on your body while you're opening it, because if a static charge could blur it, any light could affect the film. But you would drop the film into a processor, it would run it through the developer, the fixer, and then the water, and a minute or two later it would kick out a film you could hold up to a light and you could see what you wanted to see. So that's conventional radiography, film-based imaging, right? And what I'm saying about CR is it made total sense to all these X-ray techs who used to work with film. Okay, this is just like film. We put the cassette in the thing, and instead of going into a dark room, it's nice now we don't need a dark room. We'll just drop it into this reader. The reader will process it for us, right? So it was kind of a small sea change there. Digital imaging, digital radiography is a much bigger switch, right? Because now we don't need cassettes. It requires a total upgrade of all the equipment. You've got to pull out all that old equipment and replace it with brand new equipment, right? So there's some cost there. And it has the capacity to either do indirect capture or direct capture. And we'll unpack that more in a second. But in the big this versus that, if there's a one-word difference between them, one uses a cassette and the other doesn't. One uses a cassette, and the other one you just take the picture and it pops up on a screen. So if you're wondering which of the two is like my cell phone, well, every time you take a picture on your cell phone, you don't have to pull a little device out and then go develop it, right? So of the two, your cell phone is the digital radiography. And I said specifically your cell phone is using direct capture. So here's that cassette. Here's what it looks like inside the cassette. So on the back of the cassette, it normally has something to tell you how the cassette is oriented, like whether it's up or down, how you would position it for lateral versus a PA or whatever, and then it always has a barcode. And that barcode's important. And then inside of that, if we pull out what's inside the cassette, there is this white sheet of space-age stuff, right? And you can pull it out. You can take it out and clean it. In fact, I probably need to clean the ones that are here in our labs. But it is what we call a photostimulable phosphor plate. So that is built of crystals, little tiny crystals, barium fluorohalide crystals that capture the X-ray image. So there's a bunch of different ways these cassettes can look. It looks, though, to me as an old school X-ray tech, it looks a lot like the old film screen cassettes. It's a little less heavy than the old film screen cassettes, but it looks a lot like it. In fact, when I'm working with students in the lab, sometimes they grab an old film screen cassette rather than a CR cassette, and I have to tell them you can't use that. Like, it won't work, right? Normally they're made out of a durable, lightweight plastic versus the old film screens things. They were pretty heavy duty. In fact, they had lead backing in them, so you would not want to be hitting the head with an old school film screen cassette. A lot of ours are backed with aluminum. There's not an intensifying screen inside of it. So I said the film screen, it had the film sandwiched between two intensifying screens. In the world of CR, we do not need those intensifying screens that basically capture the X-rays in emitted light. Now we're using this photostimulable phosphor. And since we're using the phosphor plate, and I said that static exposure to light could mess up our pictures, right? Back when we were still using dark rooms. The same thing is true with CR. It has an anti-static material, some kind of space-age stuff, that as it's slipping that photostimulable phosphor plate out of the cassette, it's not producing static. Doesn't matter how dry the environment is that you're X-raying in, right? As that plate slips out of the cassette, no static will be produced, right? And the reason that's really important is because the static could wind up producing an image. It could make a static artifact, right? And it would look like lightning bolts going across your image. The reason I know that is because we used to worry about that on really, really dry days in Utah, whether the static would affect our X-rays. So if we were to take that X-ray photostimulable phosphor plate, and the short term for it is PSP, right? If you take the PSP and you sliced it like a loaf of bread, right? You sliced it and you looked at what's in the middle of it. You'd have a bunch of little stuff in between those layers, right? And it's important stuff. On the outside you have a protective layer. That's important, that it's got a protective layer around it. Because I mean, I don't know exactly what barium fluorohalide is, but it doesn't sound like anything I want to get in my mouth, right? It sounds like it could be a problem if I ingest something like that. So we've got a protective layer to protect both us and the material. And then right below that protective layer, we have a phosphor layer. Little tiny crystals, right? And we'll talk about what happens when those crystals interact with the X-ray, but basically each one of those crystals is in a metastable state. That means if an X-ray hits it, it's going to change its orientation just slightly. If no X-ray hits it, it sits like this. The second an X-ray hits it, it reorients, right? And it stays in this kind of excitable state until it's ready to give off the information that it's been hit by an X-ray. So that's what those phosphors do. And so below that, we've got a light reflective layer. Why would we have a light reflective layer? Well, what we're saying is the X-rays interact with these crystals, right? They produce light and they capture the X-ray, right? If we reflect some of that light back, we're more likely to capture each hit. So that reflective layer basically helps to make sure we don't miss any hits. We've got a conductive layer, right, that just makes sure that basically that this stays in this metastable state, a support layer, and then a light shielding layer and a backing layer. Those are all kind of like the structure to it. the backbone. They're not as important. They're just there to kind of hold the thing together, right? So what I'm saying is everything from support layer, light shield, and backing layer, that's really just there to hold it together. And you'll notice the very last thing is that barcode layer, or barcode label. It's there so that we can identify it. We know it's definitely the picture that we say it is, right? Because otherwise it's just a weird piece of white plastic, right? So again, like I said, it's important to kind of know this sandwich diagram, to know why these things are there and why they're important. And we've kind of walked through it. We'll go through it a little bit more. So drilling down with a little bit of depth. Protective layer. I've said this is a very thin, tough, clear plastic for protection of the phosphor layer. In that phosphor, or the active layer, you have photostimulable phosphors, PSPs, that trap electrons during exposure. So if an X-ray hits them, they trap electrons. It changes their orientation, right? Typically, this is made of barium fluorohalide. That phosphor is made out of barium fluorohalide. It can also contain some dyes that help it absorb the X-rays a little bit better, as well as helping it absorb the laser that's going to scan over it. South of that, we have that reflective layer that sends the light forward when it's released in the reader, right? So as the phosphor are giving off their light inside the reader, it's reflecting it back towards the reader, right? Sometimes this is black, so non-reflective, just to prevent the spread of light. At any rate, because we're reflecting it or what have you, we do lose some detail due to that reflective power. We're trying to capture as much information we can, but we do lose some detail in that process. There's a conductive layer in there to help, like I said, maintain that stable state or that metastable state of the phosphor. It's going to absorb and reduce static electricity inside the phosphor system, right? So we said we needed a anti-static thing inside the cassette. We've also got an anti-static conductive layer inside of the PSP itself, inside of this computed image plate itself. Okay, sometimes we have a color layer, and this is going to work similar to the dye inside of the photostimulable phosphor. And again, it's absorbing light. Sometimes it reflects light. I wouldn't get lost too much in that detail. And then, like I said, supporting layers and backing layers, and those are just kind of the backbone. That's kind of what holds it together. So I've just kind of walked us through each layer. Yes?
It says between the active layer and the support. What is the active layer?
So the active layer, again, is the PSP, the photostimulable phosphor. So what it's saying is, this is just kind of repeating what that light reflective layer. It might be there at the level of the light reflecting layer, is what that's saying. It varies based on the manufacturer. The big thing that I would take away from this is you need a protective layer around it. You got to have something around it. The important thing, the active part, is that phosphor layer. That's how we're getting a picture, is that phosphor layer. Everything else is there to support it. Right? If you understand that the key terms here are either phosphor layer or active layer, that means the same thing. And you know that everything else is either to support or protect it, you're golden. You're golden. Now outside of it, kind of encasing it, we have the cassette, right? Sometimes called the imaging plate, sometimes called the image receptor. I typically call it the image receptor, but old school techs might call it the cassette. On this cassette there's a barcode, and it's normally on a window to where when you scan it, you're actually scanning the PSP plate itself. You're tagging the plate. Why would that be important? Well, the plate's going to be slipped out of the cassette down into the reader, right? So the reader wants to make sure, yes, that's the one I'm looking at. Not the cassette body, but the actual phosphor plate, right? And so this allows us to match the image data with the exam data. So we scan those barcodes. It tells the machine what it is we did. We might also use stickers. We might write on the cassettes. We don't do that as much as we used to, but I remember when we first rolled out CR systems, we were using felt tips and stuff to write all over these things because we were so used to labeling films by hand, right? I've never seen anyone do that now, but we used to do it quite a bit. So those labels are still there, not used quite the same way. So the big takeaway here is that with CR, the patient's radiographed exactly the same as conventional radiography, exactly the same way as film. In fact, a lot of times almost the exact same techniques can be used. They're positioned the same. The cassette can be placed either tabletop or in the bucky, et cetera, et cetera. Where the difference lies between this and film is in the way that the image is then developed, right? In CR, the remnant beam, the part that's exiting the patient, the place where the subject contrast lives, right? So the remnant beam, the part that's exiting the patient of the X-ray beam, interacts with electrons in the barium fluorohalide, so it ionizes the electrons there, right? And basically, the crystals then enter a conductive state where they're trapped, right? And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the phosphor center. So when this crystal, I said that the crystal's kind of sitting in this somewhat stable state. When an X-ray ionizes it, it snaps in this phosphor center, and because it lost an electron, it changes its orientation, right? That trapped signal can last for a long time. It can sit there for a long time like this. But the deterioration does kind of start almost immediately. So the big story here is develop your CR cassettes as quickly as possible, right? But that trapped signal is almost, it's not ever completely lost. Like if you waited 2 days and developed it, there would still be an X-ray image there. You would have lost some of it, but not much. One of the things that's interesting about CR, and I know this slide doesn't point out, but just kind of an interesting bit of trivia, this is actually more susceptible to background radiation than film. So back in the days of film, the film was kept in a dark room, so no light could reach it, and it was also inside of a lead bunker inside the dark room. Why? Well, that lead bunker kept any cosmic rays from getting through the dark room and exposing the film inside of the bunker, right? Or if the darkroom was just off from the X-ray imaging suite, you would want to make sure that bunker was closed and that the darkroom door was closed before you shot any X-ray pictures. Why? Because the X-rays could get into the darkroom and expose the image, the film. That's how sensitive the film was. CR is actually more sensitive to film. But we leave CR cassettes just out and about at the department, right? It's more sensitive than film to X-rays, to background radiation, all that. But the fact that we leave it sitting out is simply this. The reason why we can do that is because the digital system cleans up all that noise. It gets rid of all that for us. With film, you couldn't clean it up. If it's there on the film, it's gone. In fact, I remember one time wasting a whole package of film because I accidentally left the drawer open and turned the light on in the darkroom. Just a momentary slip of reason, just accidentally turned the light on, ruined $500 worth of film. Just like that. With CR, you can leave it out, and the X-ray, the computer is going to clean up all that noise. So that's the power of the computer. So the CR reader is integral to this. It does not use any chemicals or anything like that. It's just going to pull the imaging plate out of the cassette and then scan it with a laser to release those electrons, those trapped electrons. It brings those crystals back into that resting state. And when they go from that active state to the resting state, they release light, right? So when they go from that active state, and this laser scans over them, they release light. That's what photostimulable phosphor means. It means when it's exposed to light, it releases light. That's what that word means, photostimulable phosphor. When you scan it with a laser, it releases light in response. So that laser is really, really important. Laser is an acronym, actually. It means light amplification stimulated emission of radiation, right? What kind of radiation? Well, it's not ionizing radiation. It's high-powered light. It's very focused light radiation. It's very powerful, though. Like if you've seen lasers used in surgery and stuff like that, you know how powerful a laser can be. They have some really weird rules, and I'm not going to get into all the rules of how lasers work. But the laser that we use for scanning CR cassettes, and this is a key term, is a helium neon laser. Helium neon gas laser. And that's important. It means it has a certain color. Specifically, its color is red, right? So we use a helium laser. Why? Because its color is red. I'll talk about why that's significant here in a moment, but for right now, just know that it is going to be red. Here it talks a little bit about how lasers are produced. It is interesting. I don't know. I have not seen registry questions about the production of lasers, but if you're curious about how lasers work, here's a little discussion of how lasers work. But basically, we super intensively reflect the light, atoms and stuff back on each other, produces a laser. All right. Now, I don't like this picture, but it's the best one that I could find. And the reason I don't like it is because it's got the laser as blue, right? But the laser is red. And we're going to scan it over the cassette. And so we use a beam deflector to scan it. If you were to open up the CR cassette reader, you would see this little crystal that's really crazy looking, and it spins around. And what it's doing as it spins around is it's allowing that laser to scan back and forth over the photostimulable phosphor plate, over the PSP plate. Right? So it's a light deflecting thing that just guides the laser down to scan over the cassette. So with the cassette, we have basically two scan directions. This is another thing that sometimes they test us on with this. We have a scan direction in which the cassette is moving through the reader. Right? So in this slide, it's calling that the cassette direction. And then we also have a laser scan direction, and that's a totally different direction, but it's pretty much perpendicular to the direction it's moving through the thing. The laser's scanning across it in a different direction. You can almost think about it as similar to a CT scan, where the PSP plate is moving through the scanner, and the laser is the CT scanner scanning across it, right? So two different scan directions.
Say that again.
Yeah.
Cassette is moving through the what?
So the cassette is moving through the reader, right? And you can hear it. You can hear the little motors making it go through the reader, right? And then it's also being scanned by a laser. So if my hand was the cassette, right? And it's the cassette direction is like this. It's going through the reader. The laser's going like this, across it like this, and it's reading it across it as it goes through the reader. So this red light is going to zigzag or create a raster pattern across the surface of the PSP. What is a raster pattern? Well, it's the way old school TVs work. If you were able to freeze frame a TV, in fact, if you want to watch the slow-mo guys, they film in slow motion, old school televisions, and you can literally watch the cathode ray gun read across the screen, and that's how it produced an image. The laser's doing the exact same thing. It's doing it very quickly, right? But that's what that raster pattern means. The laser gives energy to the trapped electrons, and so the big takeaway here, and this is really, really important, this is a major point that we're going to talk about today. The laser, again, is red. The light that the PSP gives off is blue, right? Or violet, but blue. So the phosphor gives off blue light. The laser is red. That's the whole reason we can get a picture out of this thing, right? Because what we're trying to look at is not what the laser's doing. We're trying to look at what the phosphor is doing in response to the laser. So this phosphor went into this weird state when an X-ray hit it, right? Now you expose it to the laser and it gives off light, right? What I'm interested in reading is that blue light that the phosphor gave off. So what would be the problem if the laser was blue? I could make a blue laser, right? What would be the problem if the laser was blue, though? Yeah, it would mess up my picture. What I'm trying to record is blue light coming off the crystal, so my laser has to be red, right? So that I can just capture the blue light. In essence, I'm going to use a camera that cannot see red light. It just sees blue light. Why? Because I'm only interested in the light coming off of the crystal. Goofy thing, but I always remember Star Wars Episode 4. Darth Vader's lightsaber is red, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi's lightsaber is blue, right? Darth Vader, I'm not interested in. Dark side of the Force, no thank you. That sounds horrible, right? It's not anything I'd want to recommend to my children. But Obi-Wan, I'm hoping he wins, right? So Darth Vader's, the laser, the helium laser, that's the red one. Not interested in that one. The blue lightsaber, I am interested in. That's the one that I want. That's what the phosphor is giving off. So, as this imaging plate moves through the reader, the scanning mechanism, the laser scans across it a whole lot, right? We've got this translation process, and this is kind of what I was talking about, the two scan directions. We have a slow scan direction, and this refers to the movement of that cassette through the reader. That's the slow scan, right? The fast scan is pretty much perpendicular to that. It is that laser spinning across it in that raster pattern very quickly. So the registry questions I've seen around this process focus on slow scan direction versus fast scan direction, right? And I know that fast scan direction, that's just my laser scan. Slow scan, that's the thing moving through the reader. And this is going to produce light out of that photostimulable phosphor. And then what we're going to do is we're going to amplify that light. There's a little thing that comes right after the laser called a photomultiplier. And it just scans over, it's seeking that blue light. And wherever it sees the blue light come off the PSP plate, it amplifies it. It's an interesting looking crystal too. So we got a lot of weird looking crystals inside of it. This one looks almost like a French horn or something. Or like a tuba. It's got a big receptor part to it, and it's got a part that amplifies it out, right? If you ever are there when they're doing repairs on the CR reader, it's an interesting walk through some weird crystals and stuff. All right, so that's all really good and well. We've got the slow scan direction, the PSP plate moving through the reader. We've got the fast scan direction, the laser slicing across it, this red laser. The PSP plate's giving off blue light. The photomultiplier's picking up that blue light, but that's an analog signal, right? That's just blue light. What we need to do now is convert that to a digital signal, and this is what we're going to do. We used an ADC, an analog to digital converter. We digitized this signal, so we assigned numeric values to the light, the amount of light that was red. There was more blue light here than over there. That's given a number, right? So what we're talking about is the process of digitizing the light signal. So each phosphor is scanned, it releases an electron, gives it a light. The light is picked up by this photomultiplier. That light signal is then converted to digital signal with an analog to digital converter. And that is then assigned a pixel value, a place in the digital image matrix. A place and a number. All right, that is pretty much the entire computed radiography process. But just kind of bring it back home to some stuff that we've already talked about. When we talk about CR and we talk about spatial resolution, since this is a fairly lengthy process, like it involves this PSP plate. It's got to be a red laser, blue light. Yes.
Are you skipping slides?
I don't think so.
Yeah, you got a whole bunch of extra slides in here.
Really? This is what I had on. This is what I had on Moodle. I see some other heads shaking their heads.
I think you changed it,
Did I?
I guess, because mine's in order.
Okay.
Yours is in order.
This is what I have on Moodle. So if you printed what's on Moodle, it should sync up. Maybe it just printed funny. So track what I've got up here though. So like we've said in the past, spatial resolution, sometimes called high contrast resolution, refers to the amount of detail present on the image. How small is the pixel? How small is the point that I'm looking at? That I can distinguish. That's one point and that's another point, right? We measure it in things like line pairs per millimeter, right? Film screen had a really, really high spatial resolution. Why? Because all I had to look for were these little tiny crystals. Everything I've described in the CR system is much more complicated than film, right? So CR system, it has less spatial resolution than film, right? So less detail. Where CR wins the day, and we've talked about this in the past, is in its tremendous dynamic range, right? So it has a really, really wide number of recorded details, densities that it can pick up, right? In fact, it's such a huge dynamic range that I said we can just leave the cassettes out in the department. We don't have to worry about shielding around the cassettes. Why? Because it has this massive dynamic range. The other thing that we're talking about when we talk about dynamic range is it's got a wide exposure latitude, right? Those are essentially the same kind of concepts. And the same is true. This allows for more tissue densities to be visualized on the radiograph. It gives it more detail, more contrast. So if we're talking about like a knee x-ray, just for example, soft tissue, if we're doing it on film, we could either do a soft tissue knee study or we could do a bone knee study. You could do one or the other. In fact, there were two separate orders the physician would have to put through. Or if it wasn't clear, you'd have to walk over and ask the surgeon or the physician, do you want a soft tissue study of the knee or do you want to look at it in the bone, right? In conventional radiography, right? Y'all have never had that conversation with a physician, and the reason why is because you use CR. So with just a flip of the switch, just by windowing and leveling the image, they can toggle between a bone image and a soft tissue image. What I'm saying is with film, we didn't have that power. And that power, the way that we talk about that power is it has a wide exposure latitude. It has a wide dynamic range. You can look at this as a bone image. You can look at this as a soft tissue image. It doesn't mean there's additional detail. It just means that we have additional layers that we can look at. Now, we've talked about this some in the past, but we can set a speed class to the PSP plate. Those are multiples of 100. And really, in my opinion, you just need to know it's there. It's largely determined by management. But it does have some effect on spatial resolution. If you're using a higher speed class, you will lose some spatial resolution, but you can decrease patient dose that way. So if I had a speed class of 400 versus a speed class of 100, the speed class of 100 is going to give me more spatial resolution, but at a higher dose. Final piece to CR cassettes is the plate now needs to be erased, right? We've scanned it with our laser. We've collected all the light that was emitted by the phosphors. Now we need to erase it. We basically need to wipe the slate clean. If there was some part of it that the laser didn't activate, if there's one little really stubborn crystal that's still stuck like this, even after the laser hits it, we need to release those or return those back to that other state. And so if you watch the CR reader real closely, you'll see a point where it starts to emit a really intense white light, right? It has like a really strong light source. I actually don't know what the light source is made out of, but it's very, very powerful. It's very, very white, and it's basically just washing any remnant signal from the PSP plate. If there is a slow department, right, like over in the lab here at the college, whenever I'm having my students do it, and we'll pause here after this slide, whenever I'm having them doing a experiment that requires kind of some detail, a lot of times I'll ask them, go ahead and erase the cassette before we do the experiment. Why? For just the same reason here. If it's been a week or so, and these things are sensitive to background radiation, if we erase the cassette, I just know I'm starting with a blank slate. Whatever I get on this cassette actually came from the experiment, not from background radiation. Okay, so switching gears entirely now to talk about digital radiography, DR, sometimes called flat panel detectors. These are going to use a photoconductor, such as amorphous selenium, to convert X-rays directly into electronic signals. So we don't have to develop it. It's just going to convert it directly to electronic signals. For us in radiation therapy, this is how portal imagers work, right? We're using flat panel detectors, okay? We might also use a silicon and a charge couple device, and we'll talk about what that is here in just a second, but it's sometimes abbreviated CCD, charge couple device. But the first thing we're going to talk about with digital is direct capture detectors. Direct capture. When I think about direct capture, so I've explained all this crazy bugaboo that has to happen to produce a CR image, right? You got to capture it in a crystal, the crystal gets scanned with the laser gives off blue light, blah, 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 blah. That's a whole lot. Direct capture just, it interacts with something in it, and it just got it. That was it. No lasers, no blue light, none of that. The laser, the X-ray hit it, and it's got it. Direct capture. Pretty nice. It's going to use amorphous selenium to do this. So if there's a big takeaway weird word for the day, it's definitely amorphous, right? Because what we're saying is this stuff exists in a funny state. It's not quite a fluid, it's not quite a solid, it's not quite a crystal, it's something else, right? But if X-rays hit it, it does something. That's why it's important that it's amorphous. It changes its state based on the photon interaction, okay? So what this does, amorphous selenium, it holds a charge on its surface that can be read by the thin film transistor. And we'll break this apart here in a moment. But just know you've got this amorphous selenium. It's sitting there kind of like the photostimulable phosphor layer. If the X-rays hit it, that hit is registered by an array of electronics underneath it. So where the CR cassette had this backing structure underneath it, the DR systems have transistors, very small transistors. So what are these transistors, what I'm talking about? They're super thin, like super, super thin. In a substrate support material, generally like silicone or something like that. And it detects light or electrons. It can detect either light being given off or electrons. So we'll use it in both direct capture and indirect capture systems. Once it registers that hit, it assigns it a value and a pixel location. So our TFT system, this substrate, this dynamic array, computes exactly to pixel size. So these things are super tiny. In other words, each pixel contains a photodiode, right? It generates electrical charges and it absorbs light either from a scintillator or absorbs the X-ray image, the X-ray information directly. So here we go, direct conversion, thin film transistors. So we got the X-rays coming down. They're hitting some kind of absorbing material, like amorphous selenium, right? The amorphous selenium gives off some kind of change. That change is picked up by this detector matrix, right? That's where all these little wires are right here, right? And then that's read out to a control center, right? So 1,000,000 plus pixels can be read and converted to a composite digital image in less than a second. That's what's happening every time you take a picture with your phone or every time you take an X-ray with a DR system. It's reading out millions of hits, right? So the TFTs basically work like switches. If they get a hit, they're switched on, right? If they don't get a hit, they switch off, right? But this has happened very rapidly, very, very rapidly. So they can switch on and then they're read out and then they're switched off very quickly, right? And it's read out in a very orderly fashion. Like this stuff is already organized into its data columns and stuff within the matrix. So indirect conversion, how does this one work, right? It's using essentially the same process, but there's two steps. So with direct capture, X-ray photons hit the amorphous selenium, it gives that information directly to the TFT, right? In indirect capture, there's a two-step process. So the first thing the X-ray photon's going to hit is some kind of scintillator, like cesium iodide or gadolinium oxysulfide. They're going to hit a crystal that gives off light. So they hit this crystal, the crystal gives off light, that light is then picked up by the TFT. The light is picked up by the TFT. So that's the big distinction. Direct capture, the X-ray interaction with amorphous selenium is picked up by the TFT. In indirect capture, the X-ray interaction with the cesium iodide causes light, and that light is then picked up by the TFT. So that's why we're calling it indirect capture. It's indirect because there had to be that light conversion. It was converted to light before it was converted to signal for the TFT switch. And the big difference here is that that light is going to strike now amorphous silicon, right? So in direct capture we had the amorphous selenium substrate. In this indirect capture we're going to be using amorphous silicon. Why? Because we're capturing light. That's the short answer, right? The reason we're using amorphous silicon is we're using visible light now. So in this case, the TFT switches are exactly the same. They're just picking up light impressions now from as the X-rays interact with that scintillator. So if we were to kind of slice it apart, the indirect system, and look at these things, this is kind of helpful to think about. This looks a little similar to the PSP plate, right? But there's a really, really critical difference, right? So in this one, we have the X-ray photons incident on it, right? And you'll notice there's not much of a protective layer here. It's just coming right into the cesium iodide scintillator or the gadolinium oxysulfide scintillator. It's hitting directly into this thing that's going to give off light, right? It gives off light through a very small channel, and then that's read out directly by the TFT array, right? So where the PSP system, where the computed radiography system had all this backing material and support material at the back, this thing actually has its active part, right? It has the crystal that's going to give off light, and then it has an active array of thin film transistors that are picking up the light. Okay. Amorphous silicon. So we're going to use this silicon basically to conduct a signal, right? So interacts with the crystal, gives off the light, and the silicon there picks up the light and allows it to conduct a signal to the TFT. Here's what those crystals look like, and this is one of the reasons why we use cesium iodide for indirect capture systems, is they get these really cool little light tunnel things, right? Like if you look at them, I mean, this is magnified under an electron microscope, this crystal, right? And each one of these channels is pretty darn straight, right? And we're talking about millions of these things, maybe even billions of these things covering a single readout plate, right? But definitely millions of them, perhaps over just a single transistor. But these work as light tunnels. They channel the light. So the X-ray interaction could happen anywhere inside this crystal. It's going to produce light, and it's going to channel that down towards that amorphous silicon substrate, right? So we get a really nice one-to-one relationship between wherever the X-ray photon struck and the light coming down to the receiver. So this is important to us, these crystalline tubes, because they're light directing and they work a lot like fiber optic signals, right? They conduct it straight to where we want them to conduct it. And it's going to allow for much better resolution than what we were dealing with in the computed radiography system. So better spatial resolution because we're sending the light right where we want it to go. And as a result, we're going to have less noise, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, DR charge couple devices. These are the oldest form of DR systems, and they are slightly different from indirect capture. So we will look at them here in a minute with the activity. I've seen one charge couple device in the course of my life, and it was actually as a patient. I injured myself a few years back on an anniversary trip. Had to go. My wife had to take me to the hospital. They did a chest X-ray, and the chest X-ray, the machine that they did the chest X-ray on was a charge couple device machine. I'd never seen one before, and I haven't seen one since. I don't know that they're out there at any of your clinical sites. It would look different from other CR or DR systems, right? But it does use indirect conversion, right? So the X-rays interact with a scintillation material, and then those are coupled with a series of lenses or things that direct the light to a specific area. So these lenses or these cameras are going to reduce the area down, so it's supposed to help save it some spatial resolution, and then it reads it out. It reads it out similar to the way a CR system has to be read out. They're not as efficient as the other DR systems, and they've largely been phased out. But just know that if you see charge couple devices or something, don't be scared. Just know that is one of the earliest forms of digital radiography. It uses an indirect process. Slightly related to that, we can use a complementary metal oxide silicone to basically do the same thing as a charge couple device, and that's called a CMOS reader. Again, largely these have gone the way of the dodo. They're not used quite the same amount, but I went ahead and included some information here about it. It does the same basic thing where it converts X-rays to light, and then uses a series of switches to kind of read the information out. All of this, these basically 4 different systems that we've looked at, but really direct radiography, and then the direct digital, and then the indirect systems that we've talked about. the big question that kind of guides development and that changes, where we're trying to push the state of the art has to do with the question of detective quantum efficiency, the DQE. So this is an important term, definitely something worth putting on a flashcard. And this is just describing how efficiently a system can take the X-ray that's received, the remnant beam, and convert that into useful digital data, right? Detective quantum efficiency. And it is a property, at least in part, of the system. It could also be said to be a property of these various scintillators and things. So, for example, cesium iodide, that crystal, has a certain detective quantum efficiency. It's measured by how much light does it give out when an X-ray photon interacts with it, right? So as X-ray photons interact with it, how efficiently do they change that interaction into something that can be read? As a rule, digital radiography systems have a higher DQE than computed radiography systems. For all the reasons that we've described, they're just less messy. CR has a whole bunch of steps to it. DR only has a few steps, so it has a higher efficiency. Because there's less steps. There's less stuff you have to do to get the information, therefore it's more efficient. I'm greatly simplifying it. Another way to talk about why it's more efficient is there's less noise inside the system, right? Like, think about this. When I talk about noise inside the system, if I'm taking a picture of a building with my cell phone camera, right, and all of a sudden there's an earthquake, as still as I can hold my phone, that's how good a picture I'll get. It's the noise of the earthquake isn't necessarily going to mess up my picture if I can hold my phone still, right? But imagine if the process actually had to involve, like, I take a picture, then I run it through a reader, a laser scans over it, and it reads off the laser light. Well, if I'm trying to read it through a reader during an earthquake, the laser's going all over the place, right? And so there's all sorts of potential noise inside the system, right? So there's less noise inside the system with direct radiography, less noise. Anytime we have less noise, we have a higher signal-to-noise ratio. There's more signal and less noise, right? So the system itself has more signal and less noise. And as a rule, since there are less steps in digital radiography, there's less potential for noise, right? Anytime we add an additional step, that's yet another place where noise could come in. Okay, we've talked about this some, but if we're talking about the big term of contrast, so not subject contrast, not image contrast, but just contrast in digital imaging, right? We're talking about the system's ability to reproduce an object's actual contrast, its actual linear attenuation value for medical radiography. All these digital detectors that we're talking about, both the CR and the DR systems, have much more potential to capture contrast than conventional radiography, than film, right? They can display a wide variety of contrast. You can manipulate the contrast with the programs and things like that. So the name of the game for digital imaging going forward is to increase DQE, increase detective quantum efficiency, and allow us to have greater and greater amounts of low contrast resolution. Low contrast resolution. I guarantee you something like this will be on the test. This is a major point. So let's sit on this for just a sec and talk about why this is important. What we're saying is, for digital systems, we cannot make the spatial resolution any better. That high contrast resolution, that spatial resolution, how tiny the TFTs are, how small the PSPs are, we can't make them any smaller. We cannot engineer electronic parts any smaller than what we've got. They're already smaller than what the human eye can perceive, so who cares, right? Who cares? We cannot improve on spatial resolution. We can't. We just said forget about spatial resolution. So what can we improve on? Where can we make better systems? Well, detective quantum efficiency. We can make systems that when an X-ray interacts with them, they're better about converting that to a signal. Why would we want to do that? Well, if we're better at converting photons to an image, we can reduce patient dose, right? We can reduce heat load on our tubes. We can improve efficiency and electrical power usage. There's a lot of economic reasons we'd want to do that, right? Plus patient care reasons. So we're trying to increase the DQE, increase the detective quantum efficiency. And then we want to improve this low contrast resolution. Low contrast resolution. That means the ability to tell the difference between two objects that have a very similar linear attenuation, right? So what am I talking about? Well, like, let's think about the linear attenuation of the renal capsule, right, versus like a nephron. They have different attenuation values. And it's helpful to be able to differentiate between the outside part of the kidney and the interior portion. They're very, very close to each other, so they have a low contrast between them. But can we create a system that can see between the two of them and tell the difference between the two of them? That would be the way to improve on digital systems. So, for the most part, indirect and direct radiography, digital radiography, have better DQE than CR. In fact, CR itself is about to go the way of the dodo because the federal government has said, because of this reason alone, because of the improved detective quantum efficiency, let's get rid of CR systems. So in the next few years, Medicare is going to stop reimbursing for hospitals that are still using CR systems. So if you're wondering why in the course of your clinical career you've seen more people adopt DR, it's because at the end of the day it's going to affect their pocketbook, right? If they don't improve on it. So all of these managers were really happy when they came out with wireless DR receptors, right? Why? Because you can use it like a CR system. I don't have to buy a new room. I just buy a wireless DR receptor, stick it in an old room, right? So you've seen this. This is where this is bringing us up to speed right now. The changes that you witnessed, whether or not you realized these were changes, they were changes that were happening in the course of your clinical life. DR systems have the capture technology, again, has the higher DQE of all the systems because it does not have to have the light conversion factor. So direct capture is the best in terms of DQE. There's questions about the new CMOS stuff, but I don't know. I'm not seeing it. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about real quick is spatial resolution as it relates to DR, right? We talked about spatial resolution as it relates to CR, and we said it was hampered a little bit by the fact that we're reading out the light with a photomultiplier, right? So we can have a big variation in spatial resolution in digital systems. Why do you care? Well, at some point, probably in the next 5 to 10 years, if you continue in a career in radiography, someone's going to say, hey, we're thinking about updating room number 2, right? Which one of these machines do you think is the best one, right? And you'll have to call up the people, get the price tag on the different machines, and figure out some stuff about which is going to be the best one for room number 2, right? How should the hospital spend this $1 million that they've set aside for updating room number 2, right? No, you're shaking your head, but I have been asked to do this, and I was pretty much just a grunt, right? Manager comes in, hey, Ben, we're thinking about updating room number 2. Which one of these machines would you buy? Well, the very first thing I would encourage you to look at is its spatial resolution, right? It's a big determiner, and there's a lot of variance. Even within the same manufacturer, even if I'm just talking about GE, it matters which GE model I buy. And the number one thing, the thing that's going to be kind of the fuel efficiency question, or however it is you purchase a car, like what am I interested in? It's fuel efficiency or it's horsepower or whatever, is spatial resolution, right? The reason you have the different price tag is because of this. So noise is going to be there in any particular system, and there comes a point where we can't increase the signal to noise ratio anymore, right? What we've talked about in the past is that as pixel size decreases, right, spatial resolution improves, right? As we shrink the pixel size, spatial resolution improves. But what we're saying is, at the same time, as we shrink the pixel size down, the potential for noise actually increases. So there's a tension there, right? So just going with the system with the best spatial resolution is not always the answer, right? The best spatial resolution can increase image noise. So we just have to kind of work that out, right? And think about these things. For the most part, the spatial resolution that is associated with amorphous selenium for the direct detectors and cesium iodide for indirect is higher than computed radiography, right? And that also means that as the pixel size decreases, we still have the potential to capture signal without increasing noise. Okay, so this is just a quick review. Pixel size, again, it has to do with the amount of resolution in an image. It's determined by that pixel size and the spacing between them, or that pixel pitch. The more and smaller pixels produce greater spatial resolution. So larger matrices, that's just another word for, that's matrix plural, combined with small pixel sizes will increase resolution, right? That, at the end of the day, though, does have some impacts on packs, right? So as we improve spatial resolution, we might also have to upgrade our pack's storage space, right? Because if we're getting more and more information, if we're capturing more and more spatial resolution, we just increased our file size significantly. So it does affect storage. All right, thank y'all so much.